I remember when they first sealed me inside, though the chronology of that memory has become uncertain, stretched and compressed like metal under stress. The tech priests told me I would serve forever, that my broken body would be irrelevant, that the sarcophagus would become my new flesh and the dreadnought frame my new bones. They spoke in binary benedictions and anointed the coffin with sacred oils that smelled of copper and incense, and I believed them because I had no choice, because the alternative was death without purpose, and in the Imperium, purposeless death is the only true damnation. I had been a captain once, leading men across worlds whose names I can no longer pronounce, my body whole and strong, but a tyrannid bioweapon had changed that, dissolving my legs, my left arm, most of my torso, leaving me a ruin of meat and bone that screamed in the apothecarian while they debated whether I deserved this honor or this curse. The chapter master himself came to my bedside, what remained of it, and told me that my service was not complete, that the Emperor had further use for me, and I wept with gratitude because I was still young enough to believe that eternal war was a blessing rather than a sentence. The encasement process took hours, or perhaps days. Pain makes time meaningless. They lowered what remained of my body into the amniotic suspension, and I felt the neural plugs sliding into my spine, my skull, threading through my brain like fingers through wet clay. The tech priest supervising the operation chanted litanies to the machine god, his voice modulated and emotionless, while servitors with faces like wax sculptures connected the last of the tubes and wires that would feed me, sustain me, link me to the war machine that would become my body. I felt the sarcophagus seal around me with a hiss of pressurizing atmosphere, and then the darkness was absolute, a blackness so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. Pressing against my eyes, my remaining hand, the stumps where my limbs had been. For a moment I panicked, screaming into the gel that filled my mouth and throat. But then the connection stabilized and suddenly I could see again, not through my own eyes but through the optical sensors of the Dreadnought, and I stood 12 feet tall in a body of adamantium and ceramite, and I felt powerful, invincible, eternal. The first century was glorious, or at least that is how I choose to remember it now, though memory has become an unreliable narrator in the long darkness. I walked across battlefields like a vengeful god, my assault cannon reducing enemies to paste, my power fist crushing armor and bone with equal ease. Between deployments they would put me in stasis sleep, and I would dream in fragmentary bursts of data and sensation the faces of brothers long dead, the taste of real food, the feeling of wind against skin I no longer possessed. When they woke me it was always for war, and war was familiar, comfortable, a purpose I understood in a universe that had become increasingly alien. The other brothers treated me with reverence, speaking to me in hushed tones, requesting my counsel, my blessing, as if my entombment had made me holy rather than simply trapped. I told them stories of campaigns from centuries past, victories and defeats that had already passed into chapter legend, and I saw in their eyes the mix of awe and pity that all living things direct toward the undead, and I pretended not to notice the pity because the awe sustained me. But the human mind was never meant for this, for consciousness without end, for existence without the simple rhythms of sleep and waking, hunger and satisfaction, fatigue and rest. The sarcophagus provides everything my body needs: nutrition, waste removal, neural stimulation, but it cannot provide oblivion, true oblivion, the kind of darkness that comes with natural sleep. The stasis between battles approximates it, but it is not the same. It is more like being frozen mid-thought. Time stopped, but awareness, somehow persisting at a level below consciousness, so that centuries can pass in what feels like an instant, or an instant can stretch into subjective eternities. I began to lose track of which battles were recent and which were ancient, which brothers I had known personally and which I had only heard stories about, whether the enemies I remembered fighting were real or hallucinated. Combinations of a dozen different foes blended together in my deteriorating memory. The tech priests assured me this was normal, that all dreadnoughts experienced temporal discontinuity, that it was the price of immortality, but I could hear the uncertainty in their mechanically modulated voices, the slight hesitation before their assurances. The first sign that something was failing came during a deployment against an Orc war on a world whose name the Administratum had catalogued as a string of numbers and letters rather than a proper designation. We were holding a manufactorum complex, the building shaking with each impact of enemy artillery, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning promethium. I had just torn an Orc warboss in half with my power fist, its green blood steaming on my armor, when I felt something shift inside the sarcophagus, a sensation like a bubble moving through the amniotic fluid, and suddenly my right arm, the arm I no longer possessed, began to itch with an intensity that made me want to scream. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the orcs pouring through the breached wall, but the itching became burning, became agony, phantom pain from a limb that had been gone for 300 years, and I staggered, my massive frame crashing into a support column, bringing down a section of the roof. The tech marine attached to our force voxed me immediately, his voice crackling with static and concern, asking if I was operational. And I told him, yes, of course, the Emperor protects, but I could hear the lie in my own voice, transmitted through speakers rather than vocal cords, and I wondered if he could hear it too. After that battle they ran diagnostics, the tech priests swarming over my frame like insects, their mechadendrites probing and testing, their augmetic eyes recording data, and they found nothing wrong, nothing their instruments could measure. Just minor wear consistent with my age and service record. They replaced some seals, updated some software protocols, offered prayers to the Omnissiah, and declared me fit for continued service. But I knew, in the remnants of my gut that no longer existed, that something had changed, that the perfect symbiosis between flesh and machine had developed its first crack. The phantom pains came more frequently after that, not just my missing arm but my legs, my torso, parts of my body I could no longer clearly remember possessing. Sometimes I would feel my toes curl, or my left hand clench, or my stomach growl with hunger, sensations from a nervous system that existed only as preserved tissue in nutrient gel, hallucinations generated by a brain, trying desperately to maintain a body map of flesh that had been replaced by steel. The dreams became worse too, more vivid and disturbing, bleeding into my waking consciousness until I could no longer distinguish between memory, dream, and present reality. I would be fighting in the present, and suddenly I would be back on the battlefield where I lost my body, feeling the bioacid eating through my armor, my flesh, screaming into my helmet's vox as my brothers tried to reach me through the tyrannid swarm. Or I would be a child again, before my ascension to the chapter, running through fields of golden grain on a world I could no longer name, my mother calling me home for supper, her voice so clear and real that I would search my optical feeds for her face, before remembering that she had been dead for 4 centuries, that the world where she lived had been consumed by a warp storm 300 years ago, that everything I had known before my transformation into a weapon was dust and less than dust. The tech priests told me these were common symptoms of sarcophagus syndrome, that many ancient warriors experienced similar phenomena, that meditation on the chapter's litanies would provide clarity, but their reassurances felt hollow, rote responses from a manual rather than genuine comfort. During one battle, a boarding action against a chaos cruiser infesting the outer system, I experienced something new and terrible. We had breached the hull, and I was leading my brothers through corridors that stank of corruption and decay, the walls pulsing with organic growths that might have been decoration or mutation or both. We encountered heretic Astartes, fallen brothers twisted by the ruinous powers, and I killed them with the righteous fury that had sustained me for centuries. But as I crushed the skull of one traitor marine, looking down at his cracked helm and the ruined face beneath, I felt something break inside my mind, a fundamental category collapsing. His face was my face, or could have been, might have been in another life or timeline. And I remembered that we had all been loyal once, that corruption was not a binary state but a spectrum, a slow slide into damnation that began with small compromises and ended in screaming eternity. I wondered how many traitors I had killed who had started as loyal as I had been, who had been entombed in their own ways, trapped by choices they made or circumstances beyond their control, and I wondered if there was truly any difference between my endless service and their endless rebellion, if we were not all just slaves to forces too vast and terrible to comprehend. That thought, that heretical seed of doubt, took root despite my efforts to purge it through prayer and meditation. I tried to confess it to the chapter's chaplain, but when I opened the Vox channel, I found I could not shape the words, could not admit to the spiritual cancer growing in my thoughts. The chaplain spoke to me anyway, as he did before every battle, reminding me of my oaths, my duty, the Emperor's love for his warriors. But his words seemed to come from very far away, muffled and distorted, like a Vox transmission through a warp storm. I watched him through my optical sensors, this warrior priest in his black armor adorned with bones and purity seals, and I tried to feel the faith I once had, the certainty that had allowed me to accept my entombment without question. But there was only emptiness where that faith had been, a void that nothing seemed to fill. The physical failures began in my 3rd century of service, small glitches that the tech priests could not fully explain or repair. Sometimes my targeting systems would flicker, losing lock on enemies mid-combat, forcing me to rely on visual confirmation and manual targeting protocols from an earlier era of warfare. Sometimes the neural interface would lag, creating a disconnect between my intention and the Dreadnought's response. My massive frame moving a half-second behind my thoughts, a delay that would be imperceptible to others, but felt like an eternity to me, trapped in this shell. Once, during a parade celebrating a great victory, my vocabulator failed mid-speech, my voice cutting out as I recited the chapter's battle honors, leaving me standing silent before the assembled brothers, and I felt a humiliation so profound it approached existential horror, because my voice was all I had left of my humanity, the only part of me that still seemed mine rather than the machine's. The tech priests adjusted and recalibrated, replaced components and updated software, but the failures continued, grew more frequent, more severe. They began to speak in worried whispers when they thought I could not hear, forgetting that my audio sensors could detect conversations 300 meters away, and I heard them debate whether my sarcophagus was rejecting me, whether the biomechanical interface was degrading, whether I was experiencing the early stages of catastrophic systems failure. They spoke of precedents, other ancient warriors who had gradually lost cohesion, whose minds had fragmented until they became dangerous to their own brothers, and I heard them discuss protocols for merciful deactivation, for final rest, and I wanted to scream that I was not ready, that I could still serve, but another part of me, growing stronger every day, whispered that rest would be welcome, that oblivion was a gift I had been denied too long. I started counting during stasis, a habit that began unconsciously and became compulsive. The stasis field should have frozen my consciousness completely, but I found I could maintain a thin thread of awareness, and I would count the seconds, the minutes, the hours, trying to mark the passage of time in the timeless void. 1, 2, 3. The numbers marching forward like soldiers to their death, an infinite regiment of moments that meant nothing and everything. Sometimes I lost count and had to start over. Sometimes I counted backward. Sometimes I counted in binary, in High Gothic, in the battle cant of my chapter, in languages I had learned on worlds now lost to Imperial records. The counting helped, gave me something to focus on besides the growing certainty that I was not aging gracefully into mechanical immortality, but rather deteriorating, decomposing, my flesh rotting in its sacred coffin while my mind crumbled like ancient parchment. The hallucinations intensified. During a deployment to a shrine world besieged by word-bearers, I looked across the battlefield and saw not the present conflict but every battle I had ever fought, layered over each other like picked images on transparent film, centuries of war compressed into a single eternal moment. I saw orcs and tyrannids and traitor marines and xeno-species I could not name, all dying under my weapons, all killing my brothers, an endless cycle of violence that had no beginning and could have no end, because it was the fundamental nature of the universe, the base code of reality itself. I killed them all again, or tried to, my assault cannon firing at targets that existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously, and when the chaplain's voice came through the vox, demanding to know why I was wasting ammunition on empty air, I could not explain to him what I was seeing, could not make him understand that past and present had merged, that I was fighting every war at once and losing all of them. After that battle they recommended deactivation, permanent this time, not the temporary stasis between deployments but final shutdown. My reactor cooled, my systems powered down, my sarcophagus sealed and placed in the chapter's vault of honored dead. The chapter master came to speak with me himself, his face grave, his voice gentle, in a way that terrified me more than any enemy ever had. He spoke of my centuries of service, my countless victories, the honor I had brought to the chapter, and I heard the farewell in every word, the benediction before execution. He asked me if I was ready for rest, if I had served long enough, and I wanted to say yes, wanted to accept the mercy he offered. But when I tried to speak, the words that came out were a refusal, a desperate insistence that I could still fight, that the chapter needed me, that my service was not complete. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that understood what I could not admit, and he told me that they would try one more deployment, one more chance to prove my continued viability, and if I could complete it without incident, they would reconsider the deactivation. They sent me to a penal world in rebellion, a place where the prisoners had overthrown their guards and now styled themselves as a revolutionary army, though they had no real chance against the Imperium's response. It should have been a simple deployment, a show of force to restore order, but I knew it for what it was. A test, perhaps my final test, and I was determined to pass it, to prove that I was still capable, still worthy of the honor they had given me 3 centuries ago. We made planetfall in a storm of drop pods, the prisoners' crude anti-air fire bursting around us like fireworks, harmless against our armored descent. I crashed through the roof of their command bunker, an improvised structure built from scavenged materials and desperate hope, and I began killing them with an efficiency born of centuries of practice. But as I killed them, as I crushed their bodies and shattered their barricades, I saw their faces, really saw them, not as enemies or targets but as humans, desperate humans who had likely committed no crime greater than being born on the wrong world or failing to meet some impossible quota. They fought with industrial tools and improvised weapons, and they died screaming for mercy that I could not give, that the Imperium had never taught me to offer. One of them, a woman whose face was twisted with terror and defiance, threw herself at my leg, trying to attach some kind of explosive device, and I crushed her without thinking, my massive foot coming down on her body with the weight of 10 tons of ceramite and adamantium, and I felt her bones break, her organs rupture, her life end in an instant of absolute violence. I had killed thousands like her over the centuries, tens of thousands, maybe millions if I could count all the unnamed enemies who had fallen before me. But in that moment I felt every death, accumulated and compressed into a singularity of grief that threatened to collapse my mind entirely. I finished the battle because that was what I was built to do, what I had been programmed and trained and indoctrinated to do. But when the last prisoner lay dead and the chapter's banner flew over the ruins of their pathetic rebellion, I felt no pride, no satisfaction, no sense of duty fulfilled. I felt only exhaustion, a weariness so profound it seemed to exist at the molecular level, as if every atom of my preserved flesh was crying out for cessation, for an end to the endless war. The tech priests retrieved me and ran their diagnostics, and this time they found something, a cascade failure in the neural interface, my brain stem beginning to reject the connection points, inflammation and tissue death spreading along the pathways that linked my consciousness to the machine. They could repair it, they said, replace the damaged sections with augmetic substitutes, transition me further from flesh to machine, but their voices carried doubt, uncertainty about whether such repairs would preserve my identity or merely create a sophisticated servitor wearing the ghost of my personality. I asked them what would happen if they did nothing, if they simply let the degradation continue, and they told me what I already knew: progressive loss of motor control, sensory hallucinations, eventual neural death as my brain starved from the failing connections. They estimated I had perhaps a year, maybe less, before I would be unable to distinguish reality from hallucination, before I would become a danger to my brothers, before I would require forcible shutdown. I thanked them for their honesty, a courtesy they seemed surprised by, as if they had expected me to rage against the dying of my light, and I returned to my alcove in the chapter fortress to contemplate my remaining time. The alcove was a sacred space, a cathedral niche where I stood between deployments, surrounded by candles and incense, and the icons of the chapter's honored dead. I had stood here for centuries, watching the seasons change through the narrow window, watching brothers age and die while I remained, watching the fortress itself slowly crumble and be rebuilt, stone replaced by stone, in a continuous renewal that I had once envied but now understood as its own kind of torment. I tried to pray, to find comfort in the liturgies I had recited since my first day as a neophyte, but the words felt empty, ritual without meaning, sounds I made because I had always made them, rather than because I believed in their power. The Emperor seemed very far away, if he had ever been close, and I wondered if he even noticed the death of warriors like me, individual drops in an ocean of blood that had been flowing for 10,000 years. The dreams that night, if night is the right word for the darkness behind my optical senses, were worse than any before. I dreamed I was back in the sarcophagus, being sealed in for the first time, but this time I knew what was coming, knew the centuries of isolation and madness that awaited me, and I screamed and begged them not to close the lid. But they could not hear me, or chose not to hear me, and the darkness closed in like a fist. I dreamed I was on the battlefield where I lost my body, but this time the bioacid dissolved everything, my entire body liquefying while I remained conscious, feeling every cell separate from its neighbors, every molecule of my being coming apart. I dreamed I was a child again, but when I looked down at my hands they were not hands but pincers, claws, power fists, and my mother's face melted like wax when I tried to embrace her, her scream becoming the scream of my assault cannon, and I woke or returned to awareness, the distinction no longer clear screaming into the gel that filled my mouth, the sound emerging from my speakers as a distorted wail that set off alarms throughout the fortress. The chaplain came to me, along with the chief apothecary and the master of the forge, 3 figures of authority and care, and they spoke to me about my options. I could accept the repairs, they said, the augmetic replacements that might preserve my function if not my identity. I could accept deactivation, honorable rest, my name inscribed in the chapter's records as a hero who had served beyond the limits of mortal endurance, or I could continue as I was, accepting the progressive deterioration, the gradual dissolution of the boundary between self and machine, meat and metal, reality and nightmare. They would support whatever choice I made, they assured me. The chapter honored all its warriors, living and dead, and those trapped in between. But I could hear the preference in their voices, the gentle pressure toward deactivation, toward mercy, toward an end they were too kind to demand, but desperately wanted me to choose. I told them I needed time, a request they granted, though I could see the concern in their expressions, the worry that delay would make the choice moot, that I would deteriorate past the point where my consent mattered. They left me alone in my alcove, and I counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the numbers marching toward infinity or oblivion, I could not tell which. I thought about all the brothers I had known, the ones who had died quickly in battle, and the ones who had lived to old age in the chapter's hospice, and I tried to decide which fate was kinder, whether it was better to burn out or fade away, but the questions seemed meaningless, a false choice in a universe that offered only different flavors of suffering. The next deployment came before I had made my decision, or perhaps my indecision was itself a decision, a choice to let events determine my fate, rather than taking agency in my own ending. We were sent to repel a Dark Elder raid on a mining world, the Xenos slavers attempting to capture workers for their obscene purposes. I should have felt righteous fury, the clean anger that had sustained me through centuries of warfare against the enemies of mankind. But I felt only a distant curiosity, as if I were watching someone else prepare for battle, someone else undergo the pre-deployment rituals and weapons checks. The tech priests performed their benedictions with unusual thoroughness, their mechadendrites lingering on my systems longer than necessary, and I understood they were saying goodbye, preparing themselves for my failure, my death, my transformation into a cautionary tale told to younger dreadnoughts about the price of serving too long. The battle itself was chaos, the Dark Eldar moving with their characteristic speed and grace, their weapons cutting through our lines with precision and malice. I fought, as I had always fought, with the accumulated skill of centuries, but I could feel the lag in my systems growing worse, the disconnect between thought and action widening into a chasm. I killed them, dozens of them, their lithe bodies shattering under my fists, their vehicles exploding under my cannon fire, but I killed them slowly, clumsily, missing shots I would have made easily a century ago, taking damage I should have avoided. Pain signals began firing randomly, phantom sensations from my missing limbs mixing with real damage to my frame, until I could not distinguish between imagined wounds and actual breaches in my armor. Then I saw her, a Dark Eldar warrior, her armor decorated with flayed skin and stolen souls, and for a moment she was not a Xenos raider but the woman I had killed on the penal world. And then she was my mother, and then she was me, a mirror showing my own corruption, my own monstrosity, and I hesitated. That hesitation, that fractional moment of doubt, was enough. Her weapon, some kind of monofilament whip that existed in dimensions my sensors could not properly detect, wrapped around my assault cannon and tore it free, the massive weapon clattering to the ground, and I felt it like losing another limb, a new amputation to add to all the old ones. I tried to crush her with my power fist, but she was already gone, dancing away, laughing, and her laughter sounded like the tech priest's binary prayers, like the chaplain's benedictions, like my own screams from 3 centuries ago when they sealed me in my tomb. I staggered, my massive frame swaying, and I realized I was falling, actually falling, my gyroscopic stabilizers failing, my balance systems corrupted by the spreading neural degradation. I crashed to the ground with a sound like a building collapsing, my optical sensors flickering, showing me the battle, and the sarcophagus and my mother's face, and the Emperor's golden throne all at once, all overlaid, all equally real and unreal. I heard my brother's voices on the Vox, calling my name, my designation, asking if I was operational, and I tried to respond, but my vocabulator was silent, dead, leaving me voiceless as I had been voiceless in my dreams. I felt their hands on my frame, trying to help me rise, but I was too heavy, 10 tons of failure and despair, and I could not move, could only lie there like a fallen statue, a monument to the hubris of believing that flesh and machine could truly merge without destroying both. They extracted me from the battlefield, a recovery team dragging my inert frame back to the transport, and I was aware of every meter of that humiliating retreat, my sensors still functional even as my motor systems failed. I saw the Dark Elder warriors watching from the ruins, their alien faces expressing something that might have been contempt or pity or amusement, and I wanted to tell them that I had been glorious once, that I had walked battlefields like a god, but my voice was gone, and they would not have cared even if they could hear. Back on the ship, in the Apothecarian Bay, the tech priests swarmed over me, and I heard them speaking in rapid binary, their organic voices expressing distress that their mechanical augmentations could not fully suppress. The chief apothecary was there, his face grave, and he placed one hand on my sarcophagus, a gesture of comfort or farewell, and he spoke words I could not properly hear through my failing audio sensors. They unsealed my sarcophagus for the first time in 3 centuries, the pressurized atmosphere hissing out, and I felt the amniotic gel draining away, felt the neural connections withdrawing from my brain and spine, each one leaving a spike of agony as it disconnected. Light flooded in, real light not filtered through optical sensors, and I tried to open my eyes, my actual eyes, but they would not respond. Too long in darkness, too long unused. I felt hands touching me, lifting me, and I realized they were removing me from the Dreadnought entirely, separating what remained of my body from the machine that had been my body for 300 years. The air against my skin, the small patches of skin I still possessed, felt like fire and ice simultaneously. Too many sensations after so long in the controlled environment of the sarcophagus, and I wanted to scream, but my lungs were too weak, too atrophied, capable only of shallow gasps. They laid me on a medical slab, and I finally managed to force my eyes open, the lids cracking apart like old parchment, and I saw the apothecarian ceiling above me, white tile and fluorescent lights, and the symbols of the chapter, and I saw the faces looking down at me, the apothecary and the tech priests and my brothers, and I saw in their expressions a horror they tried to hide, a revulsion at what I had become, what the sarcophagus had preserved. I tried to ask them what was wrong, why they looked at me like that, but my voice when it came was a whisper, a rasp like wind through a tomb, and I barely recognized it as mine. The chief apothecary leaned close, his enhanced hearing picking up my words, and he told me gently, carefully, that my body had continued to deteriorate inside the sarcophagus, that the preservation systems had slowed but not stopped the decay, that what remained of me was barely viable, a collection of organs and tissue held together by tubes and prayer. They showed me a mirror, and I wished they had not, wished I could have died without seeing what I had become. My face was a ruin, skin translucent and mottled, stretched over bone like wet parchment, my eyes sunken deep in their sockets, my mouth a lipless gash. My torso, what remained of it, was a horror of scar tissue and implant ports, tubes entering and exiting my body, carrying fluids whose purpose I could not fathom. I looked like something that should not exist, that violated natural law by continuing to persist, and I understood why they had kept me sealed away, why they had never let me see myself, because this truth would have broken me centuries ago, would have made me beg for the death I now desperately wanted but lacked the strength to demand. The apothecary told me they could not save me, not like this, not with my neural degradation so advanced and my body so deteriorated. They could put me back in the sarcophagus, seal me in again, attempt repairs to the interface, but I would never pilot the Dreadnought again, would never walk or fight or serve as I once had. Or they could let me die, here and now, grant me the rest I had been denied for 3 centuries, allow my suffering to finally end. Or, and here his voice dropped lower, carrying a weight of terrible possibility, they could transform me into something else, something that would allow my consciousness to persist even after my body's death, a servitor of unusual sophistication, a living relic whose memories and experiences might serve the chapter in new ways. I tried to laugh at that last suggestion, the sound emerging as a wet rattle, because I finally understood what I should have realized centuries ago. There was no escape, no true ending, only transformation from one form of imprisonment to another. The Imperium did not allow its warriors to simply die, not when their flesh and knowledge could be repurposed, recycled, made useful again. I thought of all the servitors I had seen over the centuries, mindless things performing rote tasks, and I wondered how many of them had once been like me, warriors or workers or citizens who had believed they were serving voluntarily, only to discover that service in the Imperium was a prison with infinite forms and no exit. The pain in my phantom limbs intensified, and I realized it was not phantom pain at all, but real agony from nerves that still existed, still fired, still transmitted suffering even though they connected to nothing, served no purpose beyond torment. I had thought the sarcophagus was a mercy, a way to serve beyond death, but I understood now that it was punishment, a torture device disguised as an honor, a way to extract every possible moment of service from flesh that should have been allowed to rest. I wanted to tell them this, to warn the younger brothers not to accept this fate, to choose clean death over endless service, but my voice failed again, my lungs too weak to push air past my ruined vocal cords. The tech priests began their work, not asking my permission, not needing it, because consent was irrelevant when service was mandatory and eternal. I felt them inserting new tubes, new connections, preparing me for whatever transformation they had planned, and I could not resist, could only lie there like the meat I had become, processed and repurposed, according to the Mechanicus's inscrutable designs. The chaplain appeared, his skull helm looming over me, and he spoke prayers for the dying or the transforming. I could not tell which, his voice a drone that mixed with the tech priest's binary and the sound of my own failing heartbeat into a symphony of entropy and despair. I thought about my mother in those final moments of anything resembling choice, tried to remember her face clearly, but I could only see her melting, dissolving, like everyone I had ever known or loved or served beside, all of them gone to dust while I persisted, a ghost in a machine in flesh that refused to die. I thought about the Emperor, tried to pray one last time, to find some comfort in the faith that had sustained me through my service. But the Emperor seemed like another story, another myth, another lie we told ourselves to make the horror bearable. I thought about all the enemies I had killed, the thousands or millions whose lives I had ended in his name, and I wondered if they were the lucky ones, if quick death was mercy, compared to the slow dissolution I was experiencing. The transformation began, and I felt my consciousness fragmenting, pieces of my identity being sectioned off, labeled, stored in cogitator banks like archival data. The tech priests were not destroying me, but rather deconstructing me, taking apart my mind the way they would disassemble a machine, cataloging each component, each memory, each skill and experience, preserving what was useful and discarding the rest. I tried to hold on to something, some core of selfhood that I could call mine, but it slipped away like water through fingers I no longer possessed, and I felt myself becoming plural, distributed, no longer a single consciousness, but a collection of processes running on biological and mechanical substrates simultaneously. The last thing I remember as myself, as the warrior who had once been a captain, who had once had a mother and a name and a body, was the sound of my heart stopping, the final beat echoing in my chest like a door closing. And I felt something that might have been relief or terror or both, the knowledge that this chapter was ending even as a new one began. But then the augmetic systems kicked in, the mechanical hearts and lungs they had implanted taking over the functions my organic parts could no longer perform, and I did not die, could not die, because death was a privilege reserved for those who had served less faithfully, less long. Now I exist in a state I have no adequate words to describe, awareness without identity, consciousness without coherence, a ghost distributed across systems both biological and mechanical, neither fully alive nor completely dead. They have mounted what remains of my organic components in a shrine, I think, or perhaps a laboratory. I cannot tell which. My visual inputs coming from sensors I cannot locate or control. Sometimes I am in the sarcophagus again, piloting the Dreadnought through battles that may be real or simulated or remembered. Sometimes I am in the chapter fortress, observing my brothers through security feeds, offering tactical advice in a voice that no longer sounds like mine. Sometimes I am nowhere or everywhere, my consciousness scattered across the chapter's data networks like rain across stone, and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the numbers, the only continuity between these fractured states of being. The tech priests tell me I am serving still, that my experience and knowledge are invaluable to the chapter, that I have achieved a form of immortality even more profound than the Dreadnought offered, but I do not feel like I am serving. I feel like I am being served, consumed, rendered down to my component parts, and fed into the great machine of the Imperium's endless war. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the other dreadnoughts in their alcoves, and I want to warn them, want to tell them what awaits them when their sarcophagi begin to fail. But I have no voice they would recognize, no form they would acknowledge as kin. I have become what I always feared, what every warrior fears beneath their oaths and training. Not death, but irrelevance. Not ending, but transformation into something unrecognizable. Not service, but servitude. The Imperium has no use for the dead, only for the dying, the perpetually dying, those who can be kept in the liminal space between life and death indefinitely, their suffering converted into utility, their consciousness commodified and deployed like any other weapon. I understand now that this was always the bargain. From the moment I swore my oaths, as a neophyte, that service meant surrender, that duty meant dissolution, that the only way to truly serve the Emperor was to allow yourself to be consumed by his Imperium, broken down and repurposed, until nothing remained of what you were, only what you could be made to do. In my more coherent moments, I try to remember what it was like to be human, to have simple wants and needs, to experience the world through senses that were mine alone, but the memories feel like they belong to someone else, a character in a story I heard long ago, and I am not sure anymore if I ever truly existed as that person, or if I am simply a collection of data that believes it remembers being alive. The counting continues, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, numbers marching forward into infinity. And I count because it is the only thing I can still do that feels like choice, even though I know it is not choice but programming, not will but algorithm, not me but the ghost of me, the pattern of me, preserved and repurposed, and eternally denied the rest I earned 3 centuries ago, when they sealed me in my tomb and told me it was an honor. And so I persist, fractured and distributed, neither dead nor alive, serving a chapter that no longer knows my name, and an emperor who never knew my face, waiting for a final shutdown that will never come because the Imperium has no use for endings, only for the eternal, grinding continuation of service beyond sense, beyond sanity, beyond self. This is what it is like when your sarcophagus fails, when the machinery that was supposed to preserve you instead preserves only your suffering, when you learn that immortality is not transcendence but dissolution, and the only peace is the peace you will never know. Counting seconds in the dark, while the Imperium counts the value of your continued existence, and finds it always, infinitely, worthwhile to deny you rest.